I knew the second my tires hit the gravel of Miller's Ridge that the silence was wrong. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating stillness that makes the hair on your arms stand up because the woods wearin' and oppos. T just quiet, they were holding their breath. And then the trees cleared, and my heart didn't and oppos. T just drop. It felt like it vanished into the dirt, because my home, the place I'd spent every dime of my pension rebuilding, was nothing but a pile of splintered cedar and twisted metal smoldering in the sun. I climbed out of my truck, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, and I saw it, my retirement watch, a gift for 30 years of service in the Major Crimes Division, lying face down in the mud. Before I could even reach for it, the massive yellow blade of a D9 Bulldozer roared to life, lurched forward with a sickening metallic groan, and ground that watch into the earth until there was nothing left but dust and broken glass. The operator leaned out the side, spitting a stream of tobacco juice and laughing with a kind of jagged, ugly arrogance, shouting at me to go ahead and sue because the Blackwood Heights HOA had deep pockets and I was just an old man with a ruined shack. He had no idea that I was an Oppos. T, just an old man. And he certainly didn't an Oppos. T know that after 3 decades of hunting predators who thought they were gods, I was exactly the kind of nightmare he shooed into Oppos. T have woken up. See, I never wanted to be a cop again. Not after 30 years of seeing the worst things humans can do to each other in the dark corners of Chicago. Because when you spend that long staring at monsters, your soul starts to feel like a used-up battery. I just wanted the wind through the pines and the sound of the creek. So I bought 40 acres on the edge of the county line, a beautiful, isolated patch of heaven that the Blackwood Heights HOA had been eyeing like a vulture for years. My land was what they call a donut hole, a piece of private property that was never part of their gated community, a little island of freedom that drove their president, a woman named Eleanor Vance, absolutely insane with greed. She was the kind of person who wore pearls like armor and viewed a slightly overgrown lawn as a personal insult to her dignity. And from the moment I moved in, she made it her life's mission to absorb my land into her, master plan. It started with the petty stuff, the kind of passive-aggressive nonsense that people with too much time and not enough purpose live for. Like the security guards stopping me at the main road to demand, visitor passes, from my own driveway. I remember the first time I met Eleanor. She pulled up in a pristine white Range Rover, looking at my flannel shirt like I was a stain on her upholstery, and told me that my, rustic aesthetic, was depreciating the value of her community. I just smiled, sipped my coffee, and told her that since I was an Oppos, T in her club, her opinion was about as useful to me as a solar-powered flashlight, and I watched her jaw tighten until I thought her teeth might actually crack. But people like Eleanor, they don't take no. For an answer, they just see it as a challenge, a hurdle to be cleared by any means necessary. And the escalation was textbook, something I'd seen 1,000 times in the interrogation room. First came the notices tucked under my windshield, then the mysterious nails scattered at the end of my drive, and finally, the feeling of eyes on me every time I stepped onto my porch. I'm a creature of habit. And as a former investigator, my instincts are tuned to a frequency most people can't even hear. So when the woods went quiet at 3 a.m., I knew someone was out there. I didn't call the local sheriff because in a town this small, everyone's cousin works for the HOA. So I went back to my old toolkit and installed a series of high-definition, motion-activated cameras disguised as knots in the wood of my cabin. I watched the footage on my laptop, seeing silhouettes pacing my perimeter at night, men in work boots taking measurements and whispering into radios, and I realized this wasn't an Oppos. Just harassment anymore, it was reconnaissance. They were planning a takeover, Phase 2 expansion, that required my 40 acres to connect their golf course to the highway, a deal worth millions in developer kickbacks that Eleanor had already promised to her board of directors. The day they did it, they waited for me to go into the city for a doctor's appointment. A 3-hour window they'd been tracking for weeks, and they moved with a military precision that almost impressed me if it wasn't an Oppos. T's so damn evil. They bypassed the county clerk's records, forged notice of emergency demolition, citing a non-existent gas leak, and waved that bulldozer through the back gate like they were liberating a city. When I stood there in the ruins of my life, looking at that foreman, a man named Miller who looked like he'd sell his own mother for a promotion, I didn't oppose to yell or scream. I just felt a cold, hard clarity settle into my bones. Miller held up a piece of paper, a laughably bad forgery with a scanned signature and a pixelated seal, telling me the HOA had, in quote, absorb, in quote, the parcel under an eminent domain clause that didn't oppose to even apply to private homeowners associations. I just nodded, pulled out my phone, and started recording every inch of the wreckage, every tread mark, and the faces of every man on that crew who was now an accomplice to a felony. I told Miller he had 60 seconds to get his equipment off my land, or I was going to treat him like the home intruder he was, and something in my voice, the sound of 30 years of authority that doesn't oppose, T asked twice, made his smile evaporate instantly. They scrambled out of there like rats, leaving me alone in the settling dust, and I spent the next 6 hours doing what I do best. I processed the scene, I bagged the crushed remains of my watch as evidence, I mapped the entry points, and I downloaded the cloud footage from my hidden cameras. The video was beautiful. It showed Eleanor Vance herself, standing on my porch an hour before the demolition, pointing at my walls and nodding as she handed Miller a thick envelope that I knew wasn't oppose, T filled with thank you notes. But I didn't oppose T go to the police station yet, because if you want to take down a queen, you don't oppose T just throw a rock at her palace. You undermine the foundation until the whole thing collapses into the dirt. I knew the Blackwood Heights board was a den of vipers, and vipers always turn on each other when the heat gets too high. So I spent the next 48 hours in a motel room, using my old contacts to dig into the HOA's financial records. I found exactly what I expected. Eleanor had been skimming from the end, quote, Community Improvement Fund, end quote, to cover her own gambling debts, and the developer bonus for my land was her only way to pay it back before the annual audit. I decided to play a little game of psychological warfare, the kind where you let the suspect tie their own noose while they think they're winning. So I sent an anonymous email to the entire board, except Eleanor. I included a 10-second clip of the bulldozer crushing my house and a single sentence, end quote. Who wants to be the first one to talk to the FBI, and who wants to go down with the ship? End quote. My phone started blowing up within 20 minutes. Board members who had been, end quote, just following orders, end quote, suddenly realizing that a federal conspiracy charge was, and oppose, T part of the perks of being an HOA director. One of them, a nervous little man named Arthur who handled the treasury, agreed to meet me at a roadside diner at midnight, and he looked like he had an oppose. T slept since the Nixon administration. He handed over a thumb drive with every email, every forged map, and every recorded conversation Eleanor had ever had regarding the, end quote, Miller Ridge acquisition, end quote. And in exchange, I told him I'd mention his, end quote, cooperation, end quote, to the DA. The level of arrogance in those emails was staggering. They talked about me like I was an obstacle to be removed, end quote, relic, end quote, that didn't oppose T understand the progress of a modern community, and Eleanor had even joked about how I'd probably just move into a nursing home once my house was gone. The next morning was the HOA's, end quote, Golden Gala, end quote, a black tie event at the clubhouse where they were planning to announce the new golf course expansion to the residents. And I showed up in my old dress blues, the ones I hadn't in oppose, T worn since my retirement ceremony. I walked into that ballroom, past the champagne towers and the people in $5,000 suits, and the room went dead silent as I marched straight up to the stage where Eleanor was standing at the podium. She tried to maintain her composure, her face turning a shade of pale that matched her pearls, and she told the security guards to remove the, end quote, trespasser, end quote, from the private event. I just leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, and I told the room that I wasn't oppose. T just a neighbor. I was the man whose home they'd turned into a landfill 48 hours ago. I hit the button on the projector remote I'd commandeered from the tech booth, and instead of the, end quote, vision for the future, end quote, slideshow, the giant screens filled with the footage of the bulldozer, the forged documents, and the bank transfers showing the, end quote, consulting fees, end quote, Eleanor had paid herself. The chaos that erupted was like nothing I'd ever seen in a courtroom. Residents were shouting, board members were trying to scramble out the back exits, and Eleanor stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I pulled out my old badge, sat on the podium, and told her that the real sheriff was waiting in the parking lot with a fleet of cruisers and a stack of warrants for racketeering, grand larceny, and felony destruction of property. She tried to lung at me, screaming that it was her community and she could do whatever she wanted, but she was intercepted by two of my former colleagues who were more than happy to put her in a set of stainless steel bracelets. They led her out through the crowd, past the neighbors who were now looking at her with a mixture of horror and disgust. And I just stood on that stage, feeling the weight of 30 years of exhaustion finally start to lift. But here's the thing about, in quote, justice in quote. It doesn't end oppos. T always feel like a movie ending, because while Eleanor is sitting in a cell and the HOA has been dissolved by a court-appointed receiver, my cabin is still gone. I spent the last few months living in a trailer on the ridge, watching the grass grow back over the spot where my living room used to be, and I've realized that some things can't be rebuilt. Not really. I got the settlement money, sure, and I'm building a new place, something bigger and stronger, but the memories that were in those old walls, the photos of my late wife, and the books I collected over a lifetime, those are just part of the soil now. I see the people of Blackwood Heights sometimes, walking their dogs or driving their expensive cars, and they look at me with this weird kind of pity, like I'm a victim, but they don't understand that I'm the only person in this valley who's actually free. I won the battle. I burned their little kingdom to the ground, but I'm left wondering if the cost was worth the victory or if I just became another kind of monster to stop the one at my door. I'm curious, though, if you were in my shoes, standing in the rubble of everything you worked for, would you have taken a quiet path, or would you have set the world on fire to make a point? Because people tell me I did the right thing, that I stood up for the little guy, but sometimes I look at the ridge, and I think the silence was better when I was just an old man with a shack, and not a ghost in a uniform. What do you think? Is there ever a point where seeking justice becomes its own kind of destruction, or is some, in quote, progress in quote, just a fancy word for a crime? Drop a comment and tell me if you think I went too far, or if you think I should have taken even more from them, because I'm still trying to figure out if I actually won anything at all.